Welcome to the debate. So imagine you're walking past an ancient towering cathedral covered in heavy wooden scaffolding.
Okay, yeah.
When you see a site like that, an immediate question comes to mind. Are the architects reinforcing that ancient foundation to make the building stand taller and stronger? Or, are they carefully dismantling the load-bearing walls so they can build an entirely different structure in its place?
Right. It is the fundamental question of architectural intent. I mean, is this a painstaking restoration project or a controlled demolition?
Exactly. And that architectural tension is really the perfect lens through which to view the moral and ethical framework presented in the Gospel of Matthew. We are looking at a text where Jesus directly confronts the towering, centuries-old structure of the Mosaic Law.
The whole system, yeah.
Right. So the central question we are debating today is this. Does the text depict Jesus as demanding a stricter, intensified adherence to that traditional law, or does it depict him actively subverting and replacing that law with a fundamentally new, internally driven ethic?
Which is a massive debate in textual studies.
It has. And I will argue that the text presents Jesus as the ultimate preserver and intensifier of the law, demanding a rigorous obedience that actually surpasses all previous historical standards.
And I will argue that the text reveals Jesus carefully but decisively dismantling those traditional legal boundaries, to establish a radical new paradigm, one of internal disposition and mercy that renders the old structure completely obsolete.
Well, let's get right into the foundations of the text then. When you read Matthew, the Jesus presented here is explicitly, almost fiercely conservative regarding the law.
Mm-hmm.
It is written right into the core of his primary teaching block, the Sermon on the Mount. Very early in that discourse, Jesus says explicitly, "Do not think that I have come to loosen the law or the prophets. I have not come to loosen, but to fulfill."
Right, chapter 5.
Exactly. And he goes further just moments later, stating that until heaven and earth pass away, not one iota, not one dot shall pass away from the law, until all is done.
Though we should probably clarify what those tiny measurements actually mean in practice, right?
Yes, absolutely. For context, an iota is the smallest letter in the Greek alphabet, and the dot refers to the tiny microscopic pen strokes that differentiate Hebrew letters from one another.
Like a serif, almost.
Exactly. Picture a scribe meticulously drawing the tiniest hook on a consonant. Jesus is saying those microscopic details of the law matter immensely. This is not the language of a revolutionary tearing down a system.
You think it's more conservative.
It is the language of a strict constructionist, and it is not just about maintaining the status quo either. It is about raising the bar. He warns his listeners that entrance to the kingdom of heaven requires a justice that actually surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees.
Which is frankly a staggering claim when you understand who the Pharisees were in the first century.
Exactly. The Pharisees were the ultimate legal rigorists of their day. They weren't just religious leaders, they were a populist movement dedicated to maintaining Jewish purity and distinctiveness under the crushing weight of Roman occupation.
Yeah, they built a fortress of rules to protect their identity.
Right. So to demand a justice that surpasses theirs implies a profoundly stricter standard, not a relaxed one. Furthermore, even much later in the narrative, when Jesus is fiercely criticizing the religious leaders for their hypocrisy, he still commands the crowds to observe and do everything the scribes and Pharisees say.
Because they sit in Moses' seat.
Exactly. Precisely because they sit in the chair of Moses, the historical authority of the law, and even the authority of the seat that teaches it is never questioned. It is amplified.
Well, I come at it from a different way. While the text certainly contains those conservative-sounding statements early on, the actual narrative momentum and, the specific disruptive behaviors of Jesus portray him effectively abolishing the old legal framework by superseding it.
Abolishing?
Yes. We have to look at what he actually does in the streets, not just the diplomatic language he uses to introduce his teachings on a mountain.
But his behavior is perfectly consistent with his teaching.
I don't think it is. Not if we read him as a strict constructionist, anyway. The text shows numerous instances where Jesus publicly and almost provocatively violates established norms.
Such as?
Take the scene where his disciples are walking through fields, separating grain to eat on the Sabbath. When the cultural enforcers challenge this as unlawful labor, Jesus defends his disciples not by arguing a legal loophole or a technicality of Sabbath law.
Right, he cites David.
To a higher authority that overrides the Sabbath entirely. Or consider his teaching on divorce. He overturns Moses' own explicit written allowance for a bill of divorce, declaring that Moses only permitted it due to the hardness of your heart.
Yes, but...
By doing that, he is essentially saying the Mosaic Code was fundamentally flawed, a temporary concession that he is now unilaterally revoking.
Revoking a concession isn't the same as destroying the law, though.
But look at the structural replacement that happens later in the text when he's asked by a legal expert to name the greatest commandment. Jesus reduces the entire vast legal code and the prophets to just 2 relational commandments.
Loving God and loving one's neighbor?
Right. By explicitly stating that the entire law and the prophets depend on these 2, he structurally replaces a massive external legal code with an ethic of disposition. The old rigid structure isn't just renovated, it is made obsolete.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. You interpret his actions as abolition, but I see them as the ultimate fulfillment he promised. Let's look closely at the antitheses.
The "you have heard it said" statements?
Yeah, those famous statements in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus repeatedly says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." You're arguing he replaces the law, but look at the mechanism of what he's actually doing here. He isn't erasing the law against murder, right? He is intensifying it.
By making it about anger instead of physical violence?
Right. Prohibiting anger is an infinitely stricter version of prohibiting murder. He says that whoever is simply angry with his brother or insults him is liable to the council and to the fires of hell.
Wow, yeah.
Similarly, prohibiting lust is a stricter version of prohibiting adultery. Let me introduce an analogy here. It is like a Supreme Court issuing a ruling that doesn't just uphold a foundational constitution, but broadens its jurisdiction to cover not just physical crimes, but psychological ones.
Expanding the scope.
Exactly. He makes the law inescapable. By internalizing the law, he doesn't destroy it. He closes every behavioral loophole the Pharisees had cleverly left open. The law no longer just governs your hands, it governs your mind.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered what the word fulfillment actually accomplishes in a structural sense? I mean, when a seed fulfills its purpose, it becomes a tree.
Okay.
The seed itself is consumed and ceases to exist in its original form in the process. I would argue that fulfillment in the Gospel of Matthew acts as a culmination that renders the old vehicle obsolete. To use the text's own analogy, we have to look at the parable of the new wine in new wineskins.
Ah, where he's questioned about fasting traditions.
Exactly. He is asked why his disciples don't follow traditional fasting observances, and he replies that you do not pour new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wineskins rupture, the wine pours out, and the skins are destroyed.
Right.
Let's talk about the physics of that for a second, because a modern listener might miss why that metaphor is so violent. Ancient wineskins were made of animal leather. Old leather is stretched out and brittle.
And new wine is fermenting.
Yes, new wine is alive. It is actively fermenting and releasing expanding gases. The new ethic of the heart, this intense internalized standard you're talking about, is that new wine. It is dynamic and volatile. It simply cannot be contained within the old, rigid, external framework of the Mosaic Code. The old structure literally shatters under the pressure of this new relational ethic.
Well, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because the text doesn't say the old wine was bad or that the old skins were evil, just that the container needs to match the contents. Jesus is pushing the law to its logical, perfect conclusion.
But the container still breaks.
But the internal disposition doesn't replace the external action, it validates it. But look, talk is cheap. It's easy to say you're intensifying the law in a sermon on a mountaintop. How does that actually play out when Jesus walks into town and faces the reality of everyday ritual?
Right.
If we want to see how this works in practice, we have to look at the purity and Sabbath controversies later in the text.
Yes, let's look at the streets, because this is where the intensification argument really struggles to hold water. Think about the scene where the Pharisees confront Jesus about his disciples not washing their hands before dinner.
Chapter 15?
Right. We have to remember what purity meant in the ancient world. It wasn't about avoiding germs. They didn't know what bacteria was. Purity codes were social boundary markers. They were the visible lines that separated a holy community from the occupying Roman Empire.
Absolutely.
And yet, Jesus turns to the crowd and makes a staggering claim. A man is not defiled by what enters into the mouth, but by what proceeds from the mouth.
He's redirecting them to the heart.
But he is doing more than redirecting. With one sentence, he completely bypasses the traditional Levitical purity codes. External washing customs, dietary restrictions, the very things that define the boundary markers of the community are rendered entirely irrelevant to one's moral standing before God.
I don't know if irrelevant is the right word.
He goes on to explain that what proceeds from the mouth comes from the heart, like evil thoughts, murders, adulteries. He shifts the entire locus of morality from external ritual purity to internal moral purity.
That's an interesting point that I would frame it differently. Jesus is not attacking the law itself in those moments. He's attacking the hypocrisy of how the law is being weaponized.
Hypocrisy, sure.
The Pharisees had elevated tradition above the core intent of the law. But Jesus never says the law itself is void. If you want the clearest synthesis of how Jesus views ritual versus internal morality, look closely at his blistering critique of the religious leaders near the end of his ministry.
The 7 woes.
Exactly. He castigates the Pharisees for tithing tiny herbs, mint and dill and cumin, while abandoning the weightier things of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith.
Right, highlighting their misplaced priorities.
But think about the mechanics of that kind of tithing. We are talking about farmers meticulously counting out microscopic seeds and leaves from their herb gardens to give a precise tenth to the temple.
It sounds exhausting.
It is an excruciatingly detailed external ritual. You would think, based on your argument of a paradigm shift, that this is the moment Jesus says, "Stop tithing your mint. It's a useless ritual, just show mercy."
But he doesn't say that.
No, listen to the end of that critique. He explicitly adds, "These you ought to have done," while not omitting the others. The external ritual, the precise observance of tithing, is still absolutely required.
Required, but secondary.
It just cannot be used as a substitute for internal justice. He demands both. He demands the heavy lifting of mercy without dropping the microscopic observance of tithing dill. That is intensification, not subversion.
But requiring both still fundamentally shifts the center of gravity in a way that subverts the old system. Let's go back to the Sabbath healings for a second. When Jesus heals the man with the withered hand on the Sabbath, the Pharisees immediately go out and take counsel on how to destroy him.
Right.
Why? Because they recognize what you are calling intensification is actually a radical threat to the legal order,
Well, they view it as a threat to their power, certainly.
but also a threat to the framework itself. When Jesus repeatedly quotes the prophet Hosea, "I desire mercy and not sacrifice," he is explicitly stating that the ritual sacrifice, the external machinery of the law, is secondary to or even nullified by the immediate demand for human mercy.
Nullified is a strong word.
But think about his authority. By claiming that the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, Jesus is claiming the sovereign authority to define what the law means in real time, effectively bypassing the entire rabbinic tradition of interpretation.
Yes, he asserts divine authority.
He isn't just playing their game better than they are. He is flipping the board. When he says that eating without washing hands does not defile a man, he is actively unbinding a burden that the religious structure relied upon to maintain order.
I agree, he is stripping away human tradition, but only to restore the divine law underneath it to its most rigorous form. But let's test these two theories, intensification versus subversion, against the ultimate standard presented in the text.
Okay.
If we want to know what a text truly values, we have to look at how it judges its subjects at the end of the narrative. We need to connect the earthly application of this law to its final eschatological consequences.
Meaning the final judgment.
Right, meaning how this all shakes out at the end of time. Let's look at the dramatic final judgment of the sheep and the goats.
Oh, a fascinating scene, and really the perfect testing ground for this.
Because it proves the point perfectly. The judgment is based entirely on concrete, physical actions. The king separates the nations and says to the sheep on his right, "I was hungry, and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me to drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in, naked, and you covered me."
Beautiful verses.
It's not about a vague internal feeling of love, and it's certainly not an abolition of standards. It is a rigorous, action-oriented obedience to a demanding moral standard. Those who fail to perform these specific, tangible acts of justice, the goats on the left, are cast out.
Right.
This proves that rigorous, unyielding obedience to a standard of conduct is the ultimate metric for this text. The law hasn't been dissolved into a warm feeling, it has been focused into terrifyingly practical demands for human action.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are entirely correct that the standard in that final judgment is rigorous and action-oriented. But look closely at what is glaringly missing from that grand courtroom scene.
Missing?
It is entirely devoid of traditional ritual law.
In what sense?
Think about everything we've debated so far. In this ultimate moment of cosmic judgment, there is absolutely no mention of Sabbath keeping. There is no mention of dietary purity or washing hands.
Well, sure, but
There is no mention of temple sacrifices or tithing mint and dill or reading the Torah. The sole metric, the only dividing line between eternal life and eternal punishment, is active compassion for the marginalized. Jesus calls them the least of my brothers. This proves the total replacement of the Mosaic Code with the subversive ethic of mercy. If the law as an historical institution, with all its iotas and dots, was still the standard, surely observing it would be mentioned at the final judgment.
Well, that's an argument from silence, though.
But a deafening silence. The judgment is completely blind to whether someone was a strict legalist or an outsider. It only asks if they showed mercy to the suffering. The subversive ethic of mercy has entirely swallowed the old legalistic framework.
I have to push back there. You're reading an omission as a negation, but those acts of mercy, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, are the very fulfillment of the law.
Fulfillment, again.
Yes. Remember when Jesus says the entire law depends on loving God and loving your neighbor? He didn't abolish the law there. He showed what the law was always pointing toward. The actions at the final judgment are the law perfectly applied.
But without the ritual.
The people who were judged righteously didn't even realize they were serving Christ. They were simply living out the perfected, intensified law of love. You say the map is gone, but I say they finally followed the map to its destination.
But once you arrive at the destination, you don't need the map anymore.
Interesting way to put it.
The map, the detailed, burdensome code of Moses that dictated every physical movement of a person's day, is demonstrably absent in that final scene. Only the destination, mercy, remains.
I disagree.
Look at it this way. If I tell you the entire complex tax code can be reduced to one rule, don't steal from the government, I haven't intensified the tax code. I've replaced millions of pages of complex, loophole-ridden legislation with a single overarching moral principle.
Okay, I see your point.
That is what Jesus does. He takes a religion of boundaries and purity and subverts it into a religion of boundless compassion.
But he doesn't just say be compassionate. He says depart from me. That is the language of a lawgiver, a judge enforcing a strict statute. He isn't removing boundaries, he is drawing the ultimate, final boundary based on a standard of justice that surpasses the scribes and Pharisees.
Yes, he is a judge, but the criteria of his courtroom are completely alien to the courtroom of the first century elites.
Alien to the elites, yes.
The cultural enforcers judged based on who was clean and who was unclean, who kept the Sabbath and who broke it. Jesus judges based on who fed the hungry and who ignored them. It's a total paradigm shift. It is a new kingdom with new rules, not an old kingdom with stricter enforcement.
Well, we are arriving right at the core of our disagreement, and it's a profound one. To summarize my position, I see the Gospel of Matthew presenting a moral framework where the law is brought to its terrifyingly perfect conclusion, the Restoration Project.
Exactly.
Jesus does not destroy the ancient building. He reinforces its foundations so it can reach the heavens. He demands a standard that unifies external ritual and internal purity.
When he says not one iota shall pass away, he means it.
Mm-hmm.
From the Sermon on the Mount to the final judgment, the text presents a Jesus who brings the law into sharp, inescapable focus, demanding that our justice surpass all previous standards.
And I maintain that the text reveals a structural paradigm shift. The rigid, boundary-marking codes of the past are entirely eclipsed. Jesus tears down the scaffolding to reveal a new building altogether.
The controlled demolition.
Right. By internalizing the law, bypassing ancient purity codes, suspending the Sabbath for mercy, and setting final judgment solely on acts of compassion, he establishes a radical, subversive relational ethic. It is an ethic of mercy that leaves the old legalism in the dust. The old wineskins are broken because they simply cannot contain the sheer fermenting force of this new way of being human.
Yet, despite our very different readings of the mechanics of this text, we really have to acknowledge a profound point of convergence here.
Oh, definitely.
Whether we view this as an intensified law or a subverted, replaced ethic, both of our perspectives must grapple with the fact that the text demands an incredibly high, almost impossible standard of human conduct.
Absolutely. That is the unavoidable and, frankly, uncomfortable reality of Matthew's gospel. Whether it's the intensified law you see or the radical ethic of mercy I see, the text culminates in that staggering, honking command. Therefore, be perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Yeah, verse 48.
It is a demand that strips away any sense of complacency. It doesn't let anyone off the hook, not the ancient rigorist with his rules, and not the modern reader with their vague ideas of just being a, good person.
It truly does. It leaves no room for half measures. Understanding both the deeply conservative and fiercely subversive elements of this text reveals the profound complexity of the material. Jesus operates in this incredible tension, and that text refuses to be reduced to a simple soundbite.
It forces you to think.
Exactly. There is so much more to explore in how Matthew constructs this moral universe. And we leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the evidence from the text and form your own conclusion.
The text demands nothing less than our full, rigorous attention. It challenges our fundamental assumptions about what morality even is and how it functions in society.
Think back to that ancient cathedral under renovation we talked about at the beginning. Whether Jesus is reinforcing the ancient, heavy stones of Moses so they can carry more weight, or whether he is swinging the wrecking ball to build a completely new temple of the heart, well, either way, the structure he leaves behind demands that we look up. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.